Welcome back to Dungeon Brew. Today we are continuing our tactics series where we're talking about elves. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
Hey everyone, we are continuing our tactics series where we're talking about elves today. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe, hit the notification bell so you can be updated, and feel free to leave a comment down below if you have anything to say about what we're talking about on elf tactics today. It really helps the channel to grow. Joshua, you want to get us started on elven tactics?
Yeah, so we kind of talked about this with the dwarf tactics video, and I think it's important to reiterate here that the tactics that we're talking about are probably going to be somewhat generalized and maybe more mainstream, because what elves do in your world or in your campaign is probably going to be very setting specific or culture specific for how you develop them. And it changes. I mean, we see this already from Eberron to Tolkien to whomever. Even if you're looking at Norse myth, elves are approached differently. They're talked about differently. They have different characteristics. They look different. They fight differently. They even have different homes in some occasions. So some of the things we're going to talk about may not necessarily fit in your world, and that's okay.
Right. Yeah, I think about that a lot, especially when, I think that I looked at the 3.5 manual when I was a lot younger for the first time, and it was talking about how most elves are like 5'6" or something like that. And I was like, that's not right. Because my impression was always the Tolkien elf that was taller than humans, like 6.5, maybe 7 feet tall. So there's like that huge shift in perspective, and like you were saying, it makes a lot of sense that you do approach elves with something that makes sense for your world. And then I think that affects the way that they behave tactically. A bunch of scrawny 5.5 foot tall elves running around are more likely to be, running through the trees and ambushing and using short bows and that type of thing. Whereas a 6.5 foot tall Captain America style elf is going to have a warbow and be able to, wield much more impressive weapons, melee style, than anything else. And I think that is something you have to settle on to begin with before you even approach the way that their tactics are handled.
Yeah, are my elves all Captain America replicas, or are they more akin to scrawny halflings that are tree-bearing?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it can be difficult to figure out how exactly you want to set them up. So like I said, we're going to be talking about generalized things, and maybe this isn't generalized. You can go, no, Josh, that's actually more cultural specific or setting specific. But when I think of an elf in the mainstream conceptualization of it, it is a immortal being that is imbued with magic, that lives in a society that is somewhat cultivated, and they have access to individuals that can make good weapons and make good armor in terms of those, and they may even imbue those with magic to some degree. But the big piece with elves is that immortality that they have, is that they live thousands of years, or they never die, and they can see the mortal world and the conflicts that occur in that mortal world through that lens, and that's going to impact the way that they engage in battle and what battles they choose to engage in overall.
Right. And even that, the idea of immortality is definitely a very Tolkien concept, but when you're talking about Dragonlance, for instance, they think they lived like 1,000 to 1,500 years. I think that Faerun, I think 750 years might be the benchmark to 1,000. Like, there's that huge divide in culture and setting that determines how long they live. But by and large, they live much longer, at least twice as long as the other longest lived races, which would be usually dwarves, which are around 300 to 350, which is pretty typical. Or I think gnomes maybe fall into that category as well. But you're right, that distance and that duration gives them a different perspective on the world. And I think that it affects the way that they view the world and view its conflicts and what they choose to engage in and what they don't choose to engage in. And for me, I always think about them being kind of like those parental figures where they feel that obligation to go fix everybody else's messes. And so they're kind of butting their noses in a lot of regards, going, yes, the halfling, villages are under attack again from all of these evil human monarchs, and so they're going to go protect the halflings, and then they have to engage in a battle there, and they have to go help the dwarves because they're being attacked by the orc hordes that are coming from the north, and so on and so forth. And so they become caretakers for everybody else because of their long perspective and that feeling, that need to assist others around them with conflicts that they may not be able to handle on their own.
Yeah, which I imagine has something to do with long-term relationships through generations or centuries with particular bloodlines or families or races that has brought them some sense of obligation to follow through with that. But if you want to kind of put this into perspective as a mortal trying to run an immortal being in your campaign world, I mean, think about all the differences or changes that happened from times of antiquity to the medieval ages. How many dynasties rose and fell? How many borders changed? How many people lived and died? And so for an elf to hear that there's an evil king on the horizon that, is, torturing his subjects, they're going to go, yeah, that king's going to be dead in 20, 30 years, and somebody else is going to move in and change that. They may not go risk their own lives to wage war or to battle that king in their city or to march across the land, because 30 years is a breath away for them.
Right. And again, all of this up to this point has been, what do your elves look like? Physically,
Exactly.
culturally, mentally, socially, all of these things are things that you have to decide. And there's a variety of ways to approach it that then get you into, okay, so now how do they behave tactically? So I think we're going to talk about tactics broadly with the elves because there are so many different ways that you can take them as a people, which is fun. It gives you options. It gives you a ton of options. But they are long-lived, which means that they have the benefit of long experiences, which make them very tactically savvy in the way that they approach combat. They also, like dwarves, I think, traditionally have a very slow reproduction rate, which means that they're very conservative about the way they handle their lives, but they're also, generally speaking, considered to be way more proficient. I think up until recent editions, it was very combat to give them native ambidexterity and that type of thing. They could dual wield weapons or they could do other things because they have so much dexterity and control over their physical selves that they're able to engage in combat the way that others don't normally have the capability of doing. So wielding two weapons or wielding weapons in a much more proficient manner than you would expect others, which make them very deadly in combat. They're usually, just a single elf is the equivalent of multiple soldiers of other races because their gear quality is usually higher, their skill level is usually higher, their understanding of tactics in combat is higher. They've seen it all before. They've lived for 700 years, or depending on your setting, they may have lived for 7,000 years. The common orc is not really going to be much of a threat to them because they're familiar with orc tactics and the way that orcs behave and all of the weapon swings that they do. They're like, oh yes, it's this old trick before. They've been teaching this among orcs and orc tribes for the last 1,500 years. I know exactly how to counter this and I can kill them immediately. And I think that is a very interesting way to approach elves, just in allowing their expertise and their knowledge to come through in combat.
God, that was so beautifully said, and I agree with you. I love the idea of knowing that when elves are engaging in combat, it's that they understand the tactics of the other people and know how to utilize that to their advantage in every which way.
Right.
The other thing that is, and I kind of lean towards older editions, but I also lean towards mythology around the world and how elves have been perceived in different cultures, and that they are imbued with some sort of magical or innate magical ability of some kind, especially older editions. I mean, you think about like second edition, where you have elf was a race and a class that built up together, where you had access to not only the physical prowess with weapon usage, but you also had spells that you could cast at the same time. And I think that almost any elf that is going into battle is able to utilize that in some way. Now, you can choose, I guess, what that magic looks like, but this is probably leaning on Tolkien. When you think of elves have secluded themselves in forests that are protected by magic, that have like this even illusion or enchantment magic that is built around it, where you have to roll saves to get into close proximity with them. I can see them using this on the battlefield,
Right.
where they are using illusion or using enchantment or using their innate magical ability to give them the upper hand. I'm going to confuse the orcs, or I'm going to put them to sleep, or I'm going to create a mirror image of myself on the battlefield when I'm battling, in order to give myself the upper hand to win this engagement. And not only can you see that in smaller combat scenarios, but even at large scale combat, that can be pretty exciting when you suddenly have these elves that are marching towards you, and it's like a company of 20 or 30, and suddenly it becomes 90 or 150 because they just cast mirror image. Everybody does, and they come marching towards you for intimidation.
Yeah, and you're kind of talking about like the Hobbit, Sylvan Elf type situation where
Yeah.
they're like they have the lights and the dancing and the music, and all of a sudden they disappear and they reappear somewhere else. And that idea of illusion and the way that elves use that in the Tolkien universe, it also makes me think about the Sylvanesti and Dragonlance, which are very insular. They don't allow humans or anyone else close to their woods. If anybody comes inside of it, it's like they're more likely to be killed than anything else, because their lands are protected. No one is allowed inside of it who is not a Sylvanesti elf. And so they're very aggressive, and they're very insular in terms of what they consider to be elven and what they consider to be part of their culture. So those types of concepts I think are very interesting from, how do elves behave? Are they defensive? Are they violent? Are they aggressive in the way that they approach things? They may view other peoples as being a danger to them in some way, simply because of the chaos factor that occurs with either people who are shorter lived and in some way dangerous because they're unpredictable, or however it is that they want to view it. I think traditionally for both of those concepts, the elves are very closely tied in with ambush tactics, archery, woodland proficiency, the ability to make use of their just knowledge and skill within a woodland realm. They're going to be running across treetops or through the branches, hunting down evildoers or trespassers or anything else like that, and then shooting them with bows, and you may never see them. I think this is very typical, and I think that this is the kind of thing that is easily translated into a gaming session. If you're having to cross through this protected elven territory, you're going to get ambushed at some point. You just have to be watching the treetops, because at some point you're going to see a bunch of figures fluttering by, and then a bunch of arrows piercing the ground all around you as they remain hidden and ambush you from the treetops, type of a situation.
Yeah, if they're going to attack you, if they're not going to take you prisoner and ask you questions and see what you're doing there.
Right.
But the same thing that you're talking about here, I do think that in terms of just the basic elf, they're not looking at the loss of innocent life a lot of the time. It does have to do with that stealth and that ambush and that covertness that comes about to what they're doing. So if they're at war, why line up 1,000 elves that that have slow reproduction rates, that live a long time, to go wage war against a city, when you can sneak in a handful of them to go kill the person in charge and end the war with one arrow? Yeah. It's that same thing, I think, even in ambushing in our own area. Like, let's take out the leader, or take out the captain, identify who's in charge of this riffraff, and take care of that, instead of let's line up all of our guys and fight everybody that's there in this big scale battle.
And you take that in contrast with the Tolkien elf that actually is immortal, has actual immortality, where their souls do not die. And so they are willing to march to battle. They're willing to sacrifice their lives in pursuit of a greater good, because they realize that even though their flesh may disappear or something like that, they can still persist long after the fact. Or in some cases, they actually return to physical being, like Glorfindel does. But there's that idea that, we're willing to march in rows and lines and, engage in hand-to-hand combat in an actual, pitched battle, because our immortality stretches beyond the mortal coil, and we don't particularly care about our physical selves. It's something that we have now, but we'll have something else later, and that's fine. So that perspective, I think, is useful as well, depending on the type of elf you have. So they may be more willing to engage in pitched battles, make use of their extensive knowledge of tactics and strategy in ways that are beneficial to their allies in order to accomplish something that they deem to be worthwhile.
Mm-hmm. I think we might be amiss by not just mentioning the elven archer, because I think that's the picture that comes to all of our heads typically when we think of the elf, is that it's going to be somebody, flitting through the trees and has a bow and arrow in their hand. They're shooting arrows at you. But I do think that I like having that archer option or multiple archers in every encounter when it comes to elves. I just think that, they've probably shot 200,000 arrows in their lifetime, and they're just so skilled with that they can shoot the cloak off your back without ever touching your skin.
Yeah, not to invite another Marvel reference, but they're Hawkeye. So it's like if Captain America and Hawkeye had a baby, that would be an elf, and that's I think that's generally what is considered that ideal version of what the elf is supposed to be: physically adept, physically so in tune with their own physical self that they basically are able to engage in combat in the way that Captain America does. He has the perfect balance and all those other things that make him the superior specimen of physicality. And then you combine with that the ability that Hawkeye has to basically shoot, a bow and arrow behind his head and hit the target that he wants to aim. That is traditionally, I think, what we think of when it comes to elves. We've landed on it.
I think that wraps us up. Anything else on elves then?
I do. So just real brief. They're gonna be doing the tactical things we've talked about in other videos. They use terrain. They use environment to their benefit. They have, similar to dwarves, they have a lot of physical stamina. I think in Tolkien-esque worlds, in more modern fantasy, they're in the more slender, 5.5, maybe 6 foot tall, but very scrawny version of the elf. There would be a lot less of that physicality. I think in 3.5 they actually got a constitution debuff traditionally when we would build them. So figure out where that's at. Long-term strategy is their best ability. They have a much better mind for what things are going to happen in the long term than anyone else is going to. So they're going to think about the way that certain events are going to affect future events and determine whether or not it's worthwhile. And this is something that you talked about quite a bit, where it's like, is it worthwhile to go and defeat that king? Is it even worth it to try and kill this evil monarch? Because he's creating enemies abound. Someone will kill him eventually. It doesn't need to be us. We don't need to risk our lives to do this. He's not threatening us specifically. Let's let somebody else handle it. So they may have a better view of that, or the idea that, yes, he may, kill 100 of his citizens in the short term, but what does it mean if, we go in there and lose 100 elven lives? Is that an equal trade? It's really not, so it's not worth our engagement.
And even beyond that, it's the rise and the fall of mortal lives and mortal, history kind of unfolding before them that they understand. And it's seeing whether or not necessarily will this affect us, but will this steer the path of the world into a direction that is unchangeable, or is this just part of the rise and fall of that, of what we see happen all the time through the centuries?
And then I think the last thing that I really want to touch on is just psychological warfare and morale. Again, very high morale. If they're retreating with purpose. They probably enter into combat almost every single time with a very specific exit strategy. They're not going to just willy-nilly throw their lives away for the most part. They make mistakes. They still have the capacity to make mistakes. It's just one of those things where they have a tendency to understand what they're getting themselves into before they even start that path and recognize what they need to do to withdraw. And in terms of psychological warfare, I think a lot of it is what you're talking about, where they make use of their innate magical abilities to the best of their ability. That might be illusionary type things. If you're talking about Drow, which we did a specific video on Drow, but the idea of using like the darkness innate ability, throw everybody in darkness, use illusion spells, use confusion. Those are the things that they're going to try and employ to the best of their ability, because confusion in the ranks means that they have a better ability to approach the battle from an upper hand. And I think that that's fairly typical across most elven iterations in one way, shape, or form, that they prefer to try and cause disarray or chaos within the ranks of their enemies.
Yeah, I would agree with that. All right. Well, I hope that you guys have enjoyed this discussion on elves. As always, leave us a comment down below. Let us know what you think. What else do you want to hear? And we will see you all again next time.
Judge and brew.